We're going to be studying for a little while this morning from John chapter 4. Know that John chapter 4 is a very well-known passage, probably to most of us. This, of course, is the chapter that gives us the account of Jesus speaking with the Samaritan woman at the well. I think this story gets brought up quite a bit for various reasons. Of course, this is where Jesus teaches that woman that we should worship in spirit and in truth, and we hear sermons about that pretty regularly. We hear sermons quite a bit, or hear people reference in sermons, I feel like, a lot, the interaction between Jesus and the Samaritan woman, and that's a wonderful story and a wonderful example for us to learn from. But today we're going to focus about what comes immediately after that. There's a conversation and an interaction that Jesus has with the disciples. And I know typically we focus on Jesus' interaction with that woman at the well, but there's a very important conversation and maybe a slight bit of a rebuke, but also an admonition to the disciples that I think is very important and that I think is something that I need to hear from the Scriptures. And I hope that what we have to study from this passage this morning will help and encourage all of us. Instead of just reading the whole chapter, we're going to summarize the chapter very briefly. Of course, in John 2, Jesus leaves the southern area, the area around Jerusalem, and he's traveling back up north. He's going to go back to Galilee, but he chooses to go through Samaria. Now, you've heard, I'm sure, many times about the racial hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans. We don't need to go into all of that history, but we can understand that the Jews and the Samaritans hated each other. Many Jews would actually go out of their way to get up to Galilee just so they didn't have to go through Samaria or possibly interact with Samaritan people. And the Samaritans probably happy that most of the Jews did that. They didn't want to interact with the Jews either. But Jesus takes the direct route and goes right through Samaria. And they arrive at a certain area outside of a village, and there is a well. In fact, this well is a very historical one. It's one that was dug by none other than Jacob, centuries and millennia before Jesus arrives there on the scene. But this is now an area of Samaritans, and Jesus, we're told, is weary. He is tired and worn out. So he sits down there by the well. And the disciples were told they go on into the village. There's a village very close by. They need some food. They're not traveling with a bunch of provisions. And so the disciples decide to go into the town, and they're going to buy some food so that they could all get their sustenance and rest before they continue their trip northward to Galilee. And of course, it's in this setting, as Jesus is sitting there by the well, that this woman comes out from the city, and she comes to draw water. And Jesus asks her for a drink, and this surprises her, and they launch into this conversation. And you know that story, I'm sure, very well, and you can go back and read that in John chapter 4. But over the course of that conversation, this woman comes to realize, and Jesus even tells her that he is the Messiah. And so she is getting ready to leave, but right at the end of this conversation, apparently this conversation took substantially longer to take place than what it takes us to read, because during this conversation, the disciples have had time to go to town, to buy the food, and to get back. And John tells us, just as Jesus is making this pronouncement, I who speak to you am he, and that's the Messiah, because she had said, we know that the Messiah is coming. Jesus says, I am he. Around this time, the disciples have got back, and they see Jesus talking with this woman. And John tells us that the disciples were surprised. They were kind of shocked that Jesus was speaking with this woman. They were shocked he would speak with a woman in public. They were shocked that he would speak with a Samaritan woman. But by now they've learned enough to realize, don't say anything. They're shocked. Their biases are there. But they realize they should probably be quiet and not question Jesus about why he would dare to talk with this woman. So they just kind of keep their shock and their surprise to themselves, or at least they think they do. And then the woman runs off to town, of course, and the disciples come and they begin speaking with Jesus. And let's go ahead and pick up there in verse 31. It says, meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. So the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him something to eat? Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say, there are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. Already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for eternal life, so that the sower and reaper may rejoice together. For here the saying holds true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap for that which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. And then at that point, the story shifts again, and we learn about the Samaritans. Around this point, again, that may have been a lengthier conversation than what is just specifically recorded, because in the time that the disciples come back and they converse with Jesus and they have this talk, by that point, this woman has gone back into town, and John tells us she's been telling people, come meet a man who told me everything that I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? And the people start coming out of town, and they come up to meet Jesus. We find out that they're going to ask him to stay there for another couple of days. And this whole town, or at least most of this town of Samaritans, ends up becoming believers in Jesus and become followers of him, at least in some sense. Now, there's a whole lot of things. You could give sermon after sermon after sermon, I think, from this story. But there's one thing that I want to point out that's interesting here before we dive into the text a bit and then try and make some points of application. And that is simply this: the way John tells this story actually paints a very interesting parallel. Now, I've often thought that John chapter 3, where we have this conversation with Nicodemus, between Nicodemus and Jesus, sets the stage for a conversation between Jesus and this Samaritan woman. You have two very different characters, a high-ranking Jewish leader, a lowly, questionable character, a Samaritan woman, and yet Jesus is interested in both, and I think that's true. But I also think in this chapter, John paints for us a picture that actually shows some similarity between the disciples and this Samaritan woman. Now, I'm going to imagine that the disciples probably didn't think there was much in common between them and this Samaritan woman. They're followers of Jesus. They're good Jewish people. She's a Samaritan. She's a woman. If they had known her background the way Jesus knew her background, who knows what they would have thought. But think about the way this story unfolds. When the woman comes, she is coming for water. She's coming focused on a physical need. And when the disciples come back, they come with food. They've gone to go get food. They come with food. Now, by the way, you might remember in the book of John, Jesus calls himself the bread of life. In this very conversation, Jesus mentions living water. There is a symbolism to bread and water throughout John. And it's interesting that this woman is focused on physical water. The disciples really aren't any better. They're focused on physical food. In the conversation that ensues between Jesus and the woman and Jesus and the disciples, Jesus asks the woman for water. The disciples are kind of the flip, but they're pushing Jesus to eat food. John says that they were urging him because Jesus is tired and he's sitting there, and they're urging him. They're saying, Rabbi, eat, take this food. Well, they probably would have felt better about that. They didn't have to be prompted, but their focus is what? It's the same. It is the physical, the carnal, that they are so focused on. And they do the exact same thing that this woman did. When Jesus tells the woman, if you knew who was asking you for a drink, because when he asks her for the drink, you remember she says, how is it that you, a Jew, ask me for a drink? Jesus says, if you knew who it was who was asking you, you would ask me to draw and give you living water. And she thinks this living water is some physical water. And Jesus is clearly speaking about a spiritual truth. Well, when the disciples, who again are followers of Christ and surely so much smarter and so much more spiritual than this Samaritan woman, when they come and they say to Jesus, come, eat some bread. And Jesus says, I have a bread that you don't know about. They think, someone must have brought him some bread. They make the exact same mistake the woman did. They are so focused on the here and the now and the physical that they miss Jesus' spiritual teaching just as much as this Samaritan woman had. And I say that because, one, I've not really looked at that parallelism before, but for what we're going to talk about trying to seek opportunities to share the gospel today, I also want us to learn a lesson from the disciples, and I'm speaking to myself as much as anyone here, to do so very humbly. to share the gospel passionately and with great conviction and with humility. The disciples surely looked at themselves better than this woman. And how often do we look at ourselves compared to the immoral, the wicked, the worldly people around us? And even if we don't verbalize it, how often do we simply feel in our hearts that we are better? And yet, sadly, even though we are disciples of Christ and followers of Him and we go to church, sometimes we end up making some of the very same mistakes that others do. And at the end of the day, every single one of us needs Jesus just as much as the others do. Just like the disciples needed the Lord and needed His instruction and needed His guidance every bit as much as that Samaritan woman did. And so that humility, we'll leave it there, but I just want to start with that of a humble attitude. But then I want to look at this text for a little bit and some of the lessons we learned there. We learn from Jesus something that we talk about here a lot, and it may feel like a soapbox, but I think it's one that we need to talk about a lot, and that is simply a spiritual focus. Let's look back at verses 31 through 34 again. The disciples are urging Him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But He said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." And they're confused. They say, "Has anyone brought Him something to eat?" And Jesus says, "My food is to do the will of Him who sent me and to accomplish His work." Now, John has already told us at the beginning of this chapter that Jesus was weary. He was so tired that when they get there, He just sits down. And the disciples can see His weariness so much that they just go into town and leave Him there to rest. Jesus is tired and He's worn out. And still, He is going to do the work that the Father sent Him to do. Jesus was more focused on and more fulfilled by spiritual work than physical things, even including just simple bread for nourishment. Now, we need physical things. We need bread. We need food. We need water. We need air. We need sleep. We can't just never eat and never drink anything and never sleep and kill ourselves in a week in working for the church. That's not what Jesus is saying. That's not what anyone's suggesting. But here's the point that I think we need to get. We often swing from that extreme to the far other extreme where we don't do any work for the church because we are so focused on our physical needs. We need to make a living, absolutely. And yet somehow that need to make a living trumps everything else. And it affects our church attendance. And it affects our Bible study habits. And it affects our time that we spend with brethren. And yes, we need to make a living, but it becomes such a focus that it takes away from what is a more important focus. And that is to work for the Lord and to do spiritual things for the Lord's kingdom. We talk about that a lot, so I'll end that part there. But I want to mention something about this, the fulfillment that Jesus gets in doing His Father's work. Do you think Jesus was still physically hungry? Still physically tired? I would imagine so. But He loved doing the Father's work so much that was more satisfying to Him than meeting His physical needs. How often do we want to do spiritual things? Do we want to do work for the church? Do we want to do good and to serve others or to study more, read more, grow more, whatever it may be? But we say we're just too tired. And I get it. I know now for several years I've been a preacher full-time, as we say, and I'm very blessed by that opportunity. I thank this congregation so much for that opportunity. I had a career in a secular job before this, and I know what it's like. I made many failures of my own. of coming home from a job that was stressful and that was busy and that was demanding and feeling too tired to read or to study or to pray or to do whatever? How often do we just feel so worn out by the physical things of life that we think we don't have it in us to do the Lord's work? Well, as already mentioned, perhaps there's a problem with priorities there, but I think there's also a misunderstanding. Is the Lord's work tiring? It can be. Trust me. Doing the Lord's work can wear you out sometimes. But doing the Lord's work also is a nourishment in and of itself for those who truly love the Lord and love to be doing His work. There is a satisfaction in bearing fruit for the Lord. There is a fulfillment in doing the Lord's will. Whatever results we see or don't see, there is a satisfaction and a nourishment that goes far deeper than what any meal can possibly provide. Now, do we still have to eat? Yes, obviously. But notice that Jesus was so interested in this woman, so interested in what she was doing, so interested in the opportunity that was taking place right before their very eyes, that He didn't even need to eat right then. He wanted to do the work of the Father, and that was fulfilling in and of itself. I challenge us to push ourselves further. I know that this is a place filled with people who have important jobs and demanding jobs and stressful jobs. I know that we are blessed, as our brother prayed, with young families and with 3 kids and a 4th on the way. I know that can be a demanding living situation in and of itself, and there can be days that you're worn out. I'm simply encouraging us. The next time you feel so worn out, so tired that you don't think you can read your Bible, you don't think you can pray, you don't think you can go to services, you don't think you can have that spiritual conversation, do it anyways. And see what happens. See how fulfilling it is to do the work of the Lord, even when physically you're tired and worn out. And I fully believe that if we will pour our heart and soul into working for the Lord, we will find a type of nourishment that the Lord had and that He wants us to share in. But also, in this passage, we need to say something about this concept of sowing and reaping. Commentators kind of have different ideas about what Jesus says here when He says, "Do you not say there are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest?" Some think this was just a generic proverb. Some think that literally at this time of year, there were 4 months left until the harvest. Whether this is a general proverb or literally there's 4 months until the harvest time, and in an agrarian culture, they would have been aware that it's 4 months away from the harvest. What Jesus is saying is there is typically a time for sowing and all the cultivation and work that goes into that, and there is a time for reaping, or there is a time for harvest. But the harvest has to be done at some point. Now, the sowing is important work. And whether you're a farmer or not, we all at least understand the basic idea. And we know that when a farmer goes out to plant his crops, it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of effort. He has to cultivate the ground, and he has to make sure he's got the seed, and he has to go out and dig the rows, and he has to plant the seed, and then he has to make sure it's watered, and he needs to make sure it's fertilized, and he has to take the weeds out whenever he can. And there's a lot of work, but I want you to imagine that a farmer does this, and he works, and he works, and he works, and the months go by, and the time goes by, and then finally there comes the time when the corn is grown or the wheat is grown, and the field is ready for harvest. And after all of this time of tireless work and effort, he gets up one morning and he doesn't even look out the window. And he says, "I'm tired and I'm just going to stay inside today." He never even looks out at the field and sees that it's ready for harvest. And he does that the next day and the next day. What happens? Well, there comes a point when the harvest is gone. When the opportunity has passed, and all of that work of sowing and cultivating and preparing is meaningless. Because all the work of preparation and sowing in the world means nothing if you don't do the work of harvesting. all of the Bible study, and all of the church meetings, and all of the planning, and all of the talking, and all of the working doesn't mean much if we don't actually lift up our eyes and look for opportunities to work for the Lord, to share the gospel, to serve others. There is a time, and it's important to sow and prepare, but there is a time to reap and to harvest, and we dare not miss it. There's also something interesting about this, and perhaps Jesus again is taking a physical concept like food or water, now it's in farming, and he's teaching a spiritual truth that is even deeper and more amazing. And so Jesus says, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. So he says, you typically say it's 4 months until harvest, so there's this time period, we're waiting for harvest. But Jesus says, look, there's an opportunity to harvest now. Now, that's not how farming typically works. You don't go out and plant and then the next day harvest. But, there's an interesting passage, and I wonder if Jesus was thinking about this passage when he was teaching this to the disciples. Back in Amos 9, verse 13, it says, behold, the days are coming. When you hear in the prophets, behold, the days are coming, that's looking to something in the future. And in this case, it seems to be looking towards the messianic reign or the time after the old covenant. He says, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him who sows the seed. The mountain shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. That's a weird picture. Amos is describing a scene where the planter and the harvester are literally in the field at the same time. There is such abundance that the planter can't plant before the reaper's reaping, and he can't get that row finished of reaping before the planter's planting more seed behind them. When it comes to planting corn and wheat and all the physical things of life, you plant at this point in the year and it's months later. That's not how the gospel always works. Sometimes it is. I've had studies with people that took months and months, if not longer. I know there's people in this audience that are still working and studying with people that they hope to come to a obedience of the gospel, and they're planting and they're sowing, and the harvest isn't here yet. And sometimes you talk to someone, and within a sermon, within one conversation, they're ready to obey the gospel. The concept of sowing and reaping is there. We got to realize it's not the same timeline as the natural process. Sometimes it's very quick, sometimes it's much longer. How do you know when to harvest? What Jesus says, you pay attention. You lift up your eyes. Jesus also teaches that sowing and reaping is a mutual effort. One sows and another reaps. Now, this isn't how farming always works. There's plenty of farmers in this area. They do the sowing, they do the harvesting, they do it all. But in the Lord's church, Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 3. We all play a role. Maybe you sow. Maybe someone else harvests. We rejoice together. I didn't ask for permission to use this example, so I hope it doesn't upset or embarrass anyone. But last year, as we all know, we had the blessed privilege of adding Cody and Chandler as brother and sister in Christ. That was a great honor. The day that we studied with them, and we'd had some studies with them, and they obeyed the gospel. I was privileged to get to baptize them, and that's a sweet memory for me, and I cherish it. But you know what? I had studied with them a few times, and I was able to baptize them. I probably wouldn't have had anything to work with in their family. Not been examples to them. Been bringing them to church. They had been coming to church for a while, and so this whole congregation had gotten to know them and had been examples and encouragers to them. That wasn't Nate converting them. That was their friends and loved ones, and this congregation and me all working together to sow and to harvest. And now they're sowing and harvesting with us. That's the way this needs to work. It's not James's job. It's not David's job. It's not anyone's here job to do anything all alone. We sow and we reap together, and we all rejoice together in the Lord when there's a harvest. That's how the church works. And sometimes people get to do the harvesting, if you think of it that way, and they haven't done much of the sowing. So I would love this weekend, if when Cecil and Aubrey are here, if we had some folks that were baptized. Now, it's always kind of a strange feeling in some ways. The congregation works and works and works, and some guy comes in from out of town and gives a couple of sermons, and he gets to baptize somebody. He didn't do any of the work. He just gave a sermon. Praise be to God that there was a harvest. Would love for that to happen this weekend. It's not about who gets the credit. It's not about who does the most. It's about saving souls. So let's work together. Find ways to work together to share the gospel. For the rest of our time, I'll try and be as quickly as possible as we go through the remainder of this sermon, but I want to focus on that phrase, the title. How do we do this? How do we work together? How do we prepare for the harvest? We need to listen to Jesus' instructions and lift up our eye. I think the disciples were about to miss an opportunity. If they just relied on themselves, they were going to miss an opportunity simply because they weren't paying attention. There was an entire town getting ready to come out and listen to Jesus. Those people were apparently ready to come and hear Jesus teach. Now, maybe it wouldn't have been effective if the disciples had asked them. But I do think it's interesting. All of the disciples, it appears, went into town. When they came back, not a single person from that village was coming to learn about Jesus. Here are men who are following Jesus, who they believe is the Messiah, and they haven't apparently even tried, it would appear, to get anyone in that town to come learn about Jesus. And yet this one woman of questionable character, she's had 5 husbands and is now with a man who's not her husband. At best, that's questionable. Who probably has a reputation in this town, you can imagine, is able to get the entire town to come out and learn about Jesus. There was an opportunity right in front of them, and they missed it. And they were still about to miss it. And Jesus says, pay attention. Look around you. Look up. Lift up your eyes. I want to think about that concept for just a little while this morning. Lift up your eyes. What can we learn from this? What does this teach us? One, I think it means to be wary of distractions. We've already talked about distractions a bit, so I won't spend too long on this. But part of the reason the disciples were about to miss this opportunity is they were focused on physical things, not spiritual. They were focused on buying the food. They were focused on getting Jesus rest. They were focused on getting Jesus to eat so that he could have his energy about him. They were focused on all these. None of these things are sinful either, are they? You've got to rest. You've got to eat. These are necessary daily things. And yet they are so focused on them, they are missing an opportunity. I know, again, this is one of Nate's soapboxes, but I see this not only here but elsewhere. I see it as a danger in my life. We get so focused, not on sinful things. It's not that we're just out being worldly, evil, sinful people, but we are so busy and so focused on just the mundane and the ordinary, and we never just lift up our eyes and look or see opportunities to work for the kingdom. Sometimes we miss opportunities to work for the Lord for no other reason than we just aren't paying attention. Work on not being distracted by this world. Discipline yourself to be aware of what's around you. Something else that fits within this story Be wary of bias. When the disciples saw Jesus talking with this woman, it says they were surprised. Why do you think that is? One, because she's a woman. Jesus wasn't worried about that. Two, almost surely because she was a Samaritan. I get it. Trust me, I understand. Some of the secular focus on DEI training and taking inclusion to absurd levels and immoral levels that we see in the world around us makes us, when we hear the word diversity or inclusion, it makes many of us kind of cringe inside. I get that. But let's also be honest. This country's not past racism, and neither is this world. I've traveled enough to know that racism is not an American problem, it's a human problem. It shouldn't be for the Lord's people. Chauvinism and sexism is still a real problem. It shouldn't be with the Lord's people. Bias should not be a problem with the Lord's people. But it's natural. So we have to work to overcome it. In the Lord's church, we should be the people that obviously care about other people because they are created by God. Whatever the color of their skin, whatever their socioeconomic status, whatever their education level, we love them and their soul, and we want them to come to Jesus. I think the disciples were probably overlooking this town because they couldn't wait to get out of an area filled with a bunch of Samaritans. And had they not been stopped by Jesus and told to look, they would have missed this town, which apparently was ready to come and hear him and convert to him. They would have missed it altogether because of their bias, because of their racial attitudes. I doubt they expected nothing positive from this Samaritan village. Doubt they would have expected much from this woman had they known her past. You ever see people, know people in the world, know coworkers? Think they'll never obey the gospel. You know what they do on the weekends? See the way they dress? You listen to the way they talk? Better spend my time elsewhere. Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe that person that looks so very different than you and me. Maybe that person who has a past that would make us blush if we knew a tenth of it. Maybe they are more likely to respond to the gospel than our clean-cut neighbor, clean-cut coworker that has life all figured out and is nice and comfy and cozy and basically looks like us. We just need to get them to come to church with us. They need the gospel too, don't get me wrong. But sometimes we have a bias against people. We don't just plant the word. We don't just plant the seed of the gospel. We try and figure out who it is. It's a dangerous road. Don't let bias cause us to miss opportunities to work for the kingdom. And this, just look for opportunities. Again, I think perhaps we miss opportunities simply because we aren't paying attention. Could it be that there are harvestable fields in our very lives we just haven't looked up to see? We're just going to go through this very quickly, but here's a couple of suggestions. First of all, our family. Again, I know this is starting to feel like a soapbox sermon. It's things that we all talk about. I know Matthew's talked about the family in his recent series on the Promised Land, and I appreciate his comments very much. I know many times I or the elders or the other teachers talk about the importance of family, and there's a reason, because it's vital, because it's important, because we are incredibly blessed at this congregation to have somewhere between 20 and 30 children among us. That is incredible. There are congregations in this country that don't have 20 to 30 people, and we have that in children. And I say that to say this: while we should not neglect our neighbors and our communities and foreign works and all those other things, we have an incredible mission field just in the young children that are in this audience this morning. And we need to be paying attention, and we need to be doing the work of sowing right now. Now is the time to be sowing the word in their little hearts, to be examples to them, to be teachers to them, to teach them to love the word and to follow the word. Now, the harvest may be a ways off yet, but it's going to come quicker than we realize or want. And I will tell you right now, one of my biggest fears for my own family and our congregation is that, as excited as we are right now to have all these children, is it terrifies me to think, what if in 20 or 25 years we all finally lift our eyes and they're all gone? It'll be a sad day if that happens. So what's the answer? Lift our eyes now and pay attention to them now and their spiritual needs now. I can't promise you that they're all going to be faithful. None of them will fall away. I hope not. I pray not. I can't promise you that. But I believe wholeheartedly that if we will work and labor and sow, that we will keep most, if not all of them. But if we neglect them and we get distracted by all the things in this world, it shouldn't come as a surprise one day if they're gone. It's happened in almost every congregation across this country and probably across the world. Entire generations lost because people didn't sow when they had the opportunity. But beyond just our children, think of your family. Perhaps there are spouses, siblings, nephews, nieces, grandparents. Do you have someone in your life that knows you, trusts you, loves you, that you could be an influence on, that you could maybe sow or even harvest? Look to that field. Originally, when I was thinking of this, I thought of going through kind of the common. I wanted to bring up the family. I thought about our neighborhoods, our jobs, and all these places. But instead of specific places, I just have a couple more ideas. Secondly, think about the hurting. Are there people that you know who are suffering or struggling? Maybe financially. Look, this is one I understand very well. Because whenever someone comes in those doors after a service, what do they when they're looking for something, what do they typically ask? They always say, "Who's your pastor?" And I really thought when we appointed James and David that I would get to say, "There they are." That hasn't always worked out. People are saying, "Nate's right up there." And we get to talk to these people and hear their story and hear their request, and it gets very easy to get very jaded. Here's another person asking for money. And you know what? More often than not, that's exactly what it turns out to be. But you know what else it always is? It's an opportunity. Every single time someone bothers you and interrupts your life with some request, it is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to perhaps serve them and help them in a time of real need, financially. And it's an opportunity to share the gospel in some way, to treat them better than they expect, show them kindness and love and mercy, to sacrifice, maybe even to be taken advantage of, so that you can share the kindness and the love of Christ and hopefully have an opportunity to sow the word. Now, we have to use wisdom, but when there are people in need, there's an opportunity. What about people that are suffering emotionally? People that are going through relationship problems, people that have family issues, people that are hurt and broken, people suffering from anxiety and depression, people that are hurting in ways that maybe we don't understand, but they're hurting. What about people that are physically sick and in need? Why should we think about these people and focus on these people? Well, one, it's who the Lord focused on. Remember when John the Baptist sent a message and he said, "Go ask if Jesus is the one that we look for. Should we look for another?" What did Jesus say? He said, "Tell John what you see and hear and heard, what you've seen and heard. Blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor of good news preached to them. Who did Jesus primarily focus on? Now, he spoke to the rich, he talked to the Pharisees, he talked to the healthy, but who did he especially focus on? He often focused on the hurting, the people that were sick, the people that were diseased, the people that were broken. Because the truth is, we're all broken spiritually. And sometimes the people that realize that the most are the people that are also broken physically and emotionally. Sometimes it's the people in the worst circumstances that are ready for the hope of the gospel. I'm not saying we ignore people if they make good money and they have their lives put together. They need the gospel too. But typically, they're much less susceptible to it. So don't ignore the people that are hurting. I'm going to bring up this example just because I've seen this, and it ties into the next point that I'm going to make about looking in unexpected areas. This idea of people that are hurting, people that are in need. Throughout the country, there's been several congregations that have had tremendous success, or at least a beginning, what looks like tremendous success in immigrant communities. There's places where, we know of Nashville, of course, has had quite a bit of success with the Spanish-speaking community. Know of a place where there's a population of people that are called Chuukese. I couldn't tell you where the Chuukese people come from, and I couldn't point to it on a map, but I know of a place where there's an entire population of Chuukese people that many of whom have come to the Lord's church. I just heard of one in Arizona, of a preacher who has an opportunity with a group of people that are from Russia, and I don't know if they're recent from Russia or not, but there's a whole group of people. And I bring that up to say, look around, because there are people around us. And this is the point. I want to be very careful. This is not a political sermon. But those areas are ripe for the gospel, because those people are often very anxious, very troubled. They're looking for some hope. I've had the opportunity to work with Juan up in Nashville and his brother Elias. And Elias especially, but Juan has said the same thing. And this idea amazed me. When Elias is invited into some community and he goes and he begins speaking with Spanish-speaking people, he has said if he is speaking and working with someone who is a first-generation migrant, they have just come to this country, he almost always is able to convert them. If they're second or third generation, it's very rare. Why do you think that is? Because by the second and third and fourth generation, they're like normal Americans. They're content and they're happy and they're materialistic. But that first generation, often they're escaping. I know of one place that they've had a couple dozen baptisms from a Venezuelan community that are asylum seekers. They are literally fleeing a terrible country. And they're scared and they're terrified and they're in a new place. I want you to imagine America got so bad you had to flee. And you're in some new place and everyone looks different than you and you don't understand the language. Wouldn't it be nice if someone treated you well? Wouldn't it be nice if someone wanted to talk with you and take an interest in you? That is all across our country right now. Whatever political views you have about migration and immigration, there are people in this country and even in this community that just need a nice helping hand. And when you treat them in a way that no one else treats them, and they wonder, and they even ask, and I've talked with brethren who have been in these situations, and they've said one of the things that came up that led to such excitement was when they actually showed interest in these people, they would literally say, "Why are you treating me like this? Why do you care? Why are you trying to even learn my language?" And when you can say to someone, "I'm doing this because this is what Jesus wants me to do. Because Jesus loves me and he wants me to show you his love," that's a pretty powerful statement. How many people, and broader than I just use that as an example, how many people around us are hurting or in need in some way, and if we just took a little extra time to help them, make an impact, and when they ask why, instead of just saying, "Oh, I just want to be a nice person," Just paying it forward. Instead, we say, because I'm a follower of Christ. And because Jesus cares about you, so I care about you. What would that change in our ability to bring people and convert them to Christ? And so lastly, I'll just say, or almost lastly, be wary of or look for unexpected places. If the disciples had planned a mission trip, do you think they would have picked this town in Samaria? I doubt it. And yet it was fruitful. Are there places we don't go? Are there groups we don't talk with? Are there people we ignore that need the gospel? And here's lastly, look for opportunities to work together. Already mentioned this. We're in this together. Let's work together. Let's find opportunities to sow and to reap. Part of this comes because I've been thinking for some time about how to do this, and it's one of those I'm going to quit planning and just do it at some point, I hope. So this is a heads up. I hope this isn't scary, but I hope to start reaching out to all the members of this congregation. This isn't a test. It's not to put you on the spot. It's not to make you feel bad about yourself. But if at some point in the not too distant future I call, you'll have a heads up and you can be thinking about this just to see how I can help. Are there people in your life who need the gospel? Can I help? Or can one of our teachers help? It doesn't have to be me. Can I help? Can we help? Do you have someone that needs called? Do you have someone that needs visited? Do you have someone that you think would be interested in studying, but you're scared to have that study? You don't know how to have that. Let's work together. There are fields, I am positive, in this community, in this town, in our families that are white and ready for harvest. But we have to not only sow, but reap. Maybe we just need to lift up our eyes, see the opportunity, and take it, and work together. We'll finish with this verse because it ties so well with this story. Jesus, at one point, when he was looking out upon the crowds, he told his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Pray about it. Pray for it. I want to make this point because I hear people say so often, pray for preachers. And as a preacher, I appreciate your prayers. I agree that we need more preachers, but I've heard that my whole life. We need more preachers. We need more preachers. Pray for more preachers. Jesus did not say to pray for preachers. He said, pray for laborers. That's every one of us. Pray for opportunities to labor. Pray for wisdom to see when you can labor. Pray for the strength and wisdom to labor. And just like is always true with prayer, pray, and then you do your best. Let's pray for opportunities. Let's commit to paying attention. Let's seek opportunities to be laborers in the harvest fields for the Lord.